We are set to do our follow-up of our Ten Commandments, our Trail of Grace that we were looking at the other day, this past Sunday that Doc preached on. This is Ben Bellamy. We got Doc, myself. I'm another Ben. And we'll go through just kind of a follow-up and discussion. As usual, if you guys have any questions or any comments you want to make, type those into the chat. I can see those, and we can read those and respond. Ben usually gets on there and types some stuff out a couple times as well, just to remind you. But let's go ahead and get started. What do you got, Doc?
Yeah, and if you have questions, again, you can, if you want to focus it, this is Ben the younger, that's Ben the grayer. Mm-hmm. All right? Mm-hmm. And that'll work okay. And I have to admit that I failed. I did not have any great jokes for this evening. So we're going to have to get right to the material.
Oh, man.
I hate that. I hate that.
We had 3 people just get off the stream right there.
We were dealing with a theme on Sunday that's, I suppose it'd be a surprise to a lot of people. You know, the fact is, most people see this kind of a distinction between law in the Old Testament and grace in the New Testament, and they see them as kind of worlds apart. And one of the things that we try to suggest on Sunday is that God did not of a suddenly change once he sent his son Jesus into the world. He's been gracious all along, and that's what we've been trying to track in this grace series, is that if you really look carefully at the Old Testament story, you're going to see this trail of grace that just kind of walks all the way through it, including in the giving of the law. The law itself was an expression of God's grace. And I went into one or two of the reasons why you can look at it that way. On Sunday, I'm going to reiterate one of those, then I'm going to go a little bit beyond that this evening as to why the law is part of this whole grace theme. Now, one of the things I dealt with on Sunday is this, that you have this group of people coming out of Egypt, and they had been slaves. So they had been essentially out of power for 400 years. They had been under a system where morality was not all that fixed. You know, basically whoever's in power can change the laws. There are some laws that were pretty much stable, but by and large, these were not the ones who either made them or enforced them. And so it was an immoral people without a governmental structure going out into the desert. And the whole idea is that for a civilized community, for people to function together effectively, civilly, you have to have one of two things, and either one of them works. You either have to have a very strong moral code, which means that I'm not going to mistreat you guys, and you're not going to mistreat me, because we both have a moral code that is pretty strong and similar, okay? Or you have to have laws. If your moral code is different than mine, maybe Ben, you're the outsider and you're the ruthless one, then we have to have some way of restraining you. And that's what law and courts do. Mm-hmm. They restrain those who don't behave in a civil manner. So either you have to have people behaving in a civil manner coming out of the inside, or you have to force it on them from the outside. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. For people to live together, you've either got to have morality or law, a justice system.
I think that's what they used to call a social contract.
Yes. In fact, we're going to go back to a little bit of that. This is going to be a little bit, it's going to like political philosophy. Because this sort of thing was recognized by the people who established our country. Okay? Mm-hmm. There was a guy by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
Mm-hmm. That's familiar.
Okay? Mm-hmm. He wrote a book called Democracy in America. And he was a European who came over and said, why does this thing work? Why does it seem to work well? Why is it, in some respects, working with more freedoms than you see even in the European countries? Why is it that freedom seems to be working here? Okay? And basically, he wrote this thing, and a big part of it was this idea that you either have to have self-government or you have to have a strong central government. One of the two. People either have to govern themselves through a very firm morality, or you need strong governments, less freedom, like you would have seen in Europe, that is enforcing some kind of a common moral code, even if it's not your own personal moral code. You might think it's personally fine to steal from me or to cheat me on a contract or whatever, but there has to be something if we're going to have a civil relationship among people, we have to have something that's going to enforce a morality, or it's got to come from the inside. Self-government or a strong government. Does that make sense? It's going to be one of the two. I have down self-government or government. One of the two is going to be required. And therefore, he says, de Tocqueville says, religion, fierce religion, a strong religion / morality is necessary for a free people. If there's going to be freedom, then morality is going to have to come from the inside.
Mm-hmm.
If there is no morality coming from the inside, then you have to restrict freedom. That's when law, justice has to be more rigorous. Does that make sense? To the degree people are internally moral, they can be more free. You don't need as many laws to dictate their behavior. The less moral they are, the more laws you need, the stronger the justice system that you need. Otherwise, there's going to be tyranny. Okay? If there's not morality, there's going to be tyranny. And even if there's a strong government, you got the possibility of tyranny.
Yes.
But where is it going to come from? Okay? And so he said, religion, he said, religion should be considered the first of America's political institutions. Now, he said religion is the most important of our political institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean establish a national religion.
Oh.
But he said if the politics are going to work, if free politics are going to work, you have to have a strong religion, religious base, because where else is the morality going to come from? And he said it is necessary that Americans maintain, this is de Tocqueville, it's necessary that Americans maintain Christianity at all cost. That was his conclusion. Now, of course, this was written back in the 1700s. Okay?
There was a lot written back there that's still true.
It is. In fact, it's going to be, this is actually going to be a philosophical idea that some people will trace in people like Plato and Aristotle, John Locke, Burke. A lot of the philosophers at that time were seeing the connection between freedom and morality, and the necessity of stronger government if there is not a stronger morality. Okay, that's just an equation that they were working with. Now, I don't think I have this one on a slide. That's what I had for him. But this is what de Tocqueville said. He says, I sought for the greatness and genius of America. I looked for it. Why is she great? And I looked in her commodious harbors and her ample rivers, and it was not there. It's a lush land. I looked in her fertile fields and her boundless prairies, and it was not there. I looked in her rich mines and her vast world commerce, and it was not there. Then he said, not until I went to the churches of America and heard the pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and her power. America is great because she's good, and if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. Now, I don't do this because I'm trying to talk about American politics. I'm doing this so I can understand what God was doing in the desert.
Same principles apply then.
The same principles are going to be applicable. Morality or government, which is it? And I can tell you that laws are easier to institute than morality. Morality takes time to cultivate. Laws you can just simply put into force. But one of the two is going to be absolutely necessary for a community to function civilly. He's trying to build a nation out of slaves who had no experience in government or law. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's why I went to this thing.
Is this a good time to interrupt you?
Sure, absolutely.
All right, so I've got a lot of things bounce around in my head, all right? Starting with, if we go back a while, I believe it was in this series, we talked about how sin, I think this is some of the language that we've used even recently, just talking about this, that sin isn't breaking of a rule, it's the breaking of a relationship.
Yes.
Okay? And then you combine that with the 10 Commandments, you may be going there, but we talked about how the last 6 commandments deal a lot about relationship and how we interact with each other. Ultimately, what we see is rules and laws being instituted for the protection of relationships.
Absolutely.
A along with that, so then if you begin kind of putting all these pieces together, it makes sense that God would have to step in and communicate these things to a people who don't have that morality from within. They weren't coming from a deeply moral place. They weren't coming. Even if Egypt had been a very moral place, they weren't really Egypt. They were subservient to it. They had kind of their own subculture, most likely, within all that. Mm-hmm. They would have adopted some things here and there, but they would have definitely needed some instruction, direction. You also combine that with the American experiment, as we're talking about here. And just now, as you talk about the ceasing to be good and then ceasing to be great, this even quote that we have on the screen, that makes me think of the book of Judges.
Yes.
And how you had a nation that God had led, morality had been established. They did know what was expected.
They dumped it.
And then they would throw it off. They'd do whatever they wanted, and then they would cease to be this nation that God was taking care of. So eventually they would come back around and some sort of a national repentance. Mm-hmm. God would protect, deliver, but you just see that cycle over and over again.
Yeah, they would do whatever they wanted in their eyes. Chaos would erupt. They'd finally have some kind of a judge come in and establish law, perhaps morality again, and then they'd fall into the same cycle. It is a cycle that repeats itself in Judges. But you got to remember these.
That phrasing you used this past Sunday of everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's the popular refrain throughout the book of Judges. Well, we see it in Genesis. It doesn't start in Judges. We see the same kind of thing, and I think that's where these rules all of a sudden start coming in as God's trying to lead them and direct them as to what's right.
Yeah, and I just think this whole idea, law here is given as a gift in order to get these people started. It was never intended to be the end, where follow these rules and you're in. Mm-hmm. That was not its purpose. He had already chosen them as his people. They were his people. But how were they going to do life with him, and how are they going to do life with each other? They had no clue. Mm-hmm. They were coming out of an idolatrous land. They didn't have the law yet. That's why Moses was giving it to them. Okay? Yeah. They didn't have any really grounded system of morality that made sense. They didn't have any grounded system of how to treat each other that made sense. You know, in a world without this kind of without a kind of a moral code that is stable, it's going to be chaotic. Mm-hmm. And so I think the very giving of the law was an act of grace by God, not intended to be the end, but it was necessary. Now, I want to go one other place, and again, I just want to make this point from our earliest guys. Go ahead, Ben.
I was just thinking, it occurs to me
Ben
that if you look at recent history, communism tried to do the same thing, put a philosophy in place of a religion, and they ended up where the philosophy doesn't work and totalitarianism does.
Law works a little better, unless it's a really fierce morality that comes deep from the inside, which is where Jesus is trying to take us, which is why he said there are two laws that really matter, and one is love God with all you got, and number love each other as you love yourself. And if you do those two things, you don't need a lot of laws. You're going to do it intuitively. Okay?
Isn't that a fascinating concept, though? Think about that from a community legal mindset, and think about all the different laws that we interact with on a daily basis. And so that goes from speed limits to and from work. It has to do with how you change lanes. It has to do with the respect of traffic lights. If you've ever been in a country where those things don't exist and it's just chaos, you understand that there's not a lot of loving one another when you're on the roads,
No.
right? There's not a lot in the organized system with all these laws either. But you think through, if everyone was actually capable of, on their own, monitoring themselves with the idea of being able to love God and love others, all these other laws would actually just seem like overkill and unnecessary because we're already treating people the way in which we need to treat them.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Freedom is possible once there's morality. Without morality, freedom is a very dangerous thing, which is what we're seeing in our culture. Mm-hmm. Freedom becomes very, very dangerous. But this is George Washington. I think part of this, at least some of this, comes out of his farewell address. He says that religion and morality are the firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. They are indispensable supports of the dispositions and habits that lead to prosperity. He says morality depends on religion. Okay? And then he made this quote, which I put up on the screen. Reason and experience both think it through and look at how it happens. Both reason and experience forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in the exclusion of religious principle. How do you expect to be moral without religion? How are you going to get it? How are you going to get there? He says. Okay? So religion, he says, is necessary to the preservation of free government. If it's going to be free, now again, that's the key to free government. Because the more moral you are, the more freedom you can have. But how are you going to establish morality without religion? I'm telling you, a lot of people are trying to do it right now. They're trying to cultivate a moral system without God. Good luck.
It's secular humanism, right?
Yes.
And it's this idea that somehow we've evolved enough to understand how we ought to treat each other, and if we can create this set of rules to treat each other better, then we'll somehow evolve even further. The problem with that is they're basing it off of only experience. It's interesting. Reason and experience forbids to expect that morality can prevail outside of religious principle. We're trying to use our past experiences and what we think we've learned and understood, except we're removing the piece that gave us that knowledge and understanding, thinking that somehow if we can just get better at these things, and all that flies in the face of why Jesus was sent, right?
Exactly.
Which is another interesting thing to this.
You know,
We have this law that God gives us, which is a great grace, but it doesn't really actually make us any better at being moral
No.
in
But
and of ourselves.
It steers us to kind of, we'll get to that, we'll get to that piece.
there's a saying I've been exposed to for years now that you can't legislate morality,
You cannot.
and it's a much
But you can
deeper-
legislate good behavior. But who gets to dictate what's good? That's going to be one of the
Right.
keys that we're going to get to.
Right.
It's constantly shifting. But again, we're seeing that more even with secular humanism now.
Unless it comes from God, it's always going to constantly shift. And what you're talking about is this, can we do a moral system without it? It's always based on some kind of enlightened self-interest. That's kind of the phrase that I go back to on occasion, which means that if I act well and then you act by the same principles and Ben acts by the same principles, and we're going to have the best life together. It's enlightened self-interest. It's going to be best for me if I behave the way I want you to treat me. But if it's based on self-interest, if you can go ahead and get self ahead by breaking the system, what's to prevent it? You see, the difference between enlightened self-interest and Christianity is it's selfless interest. It's God-centered interest. And right there is one of the key differences. And so Christianity, our morality, is love God and love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Okay? Love even the way Jesus said it, love him the way I love him. Treat him even better than you might have treated yourself. And so if you go to that selflessness, that is the foundation for Christian-centered morality. Selfishness is the foundation for not God-centered morality. One way or the other, some kind of enlightened self-interest. At least that's to me, it's the simplest way of looking at it. Now, there are people who might come back, but I'd love to argue. Any case, again, why does it relate to the Old Testament law? Because you have a people without law and you have a people without morality. God gave them law as a tool to civilize them and to start cultivating a morality. You begin to understand, okay? Again, it's temporary. But I want to go back to that idea that both of you guys raised, okay? Where does it come from? I can create a moral code, but my suspicion is that you're going to tweak the edges, okay? You're going to come up with your own moral code. You're probably going to come back with some statement like, just because it's right for you doesn't mean it's right for me.
And that's in my opinion, a ridiculous statement, but it makes complete sense if there's no divine actor outside of ourselves.
If there's no divine actor, why not?
Yeah.
And on top of that, the morality of our faith is time-tested. This isn't just a new experiment like the United States is. Our morality, our religion has been time-tested in all sorts of different circumstances by all sorts of different people, and it has stood the test of time.
There's not a
God
culture.
kind of does. But go ahead.
Well, there's not a culture that has challenged the idea that murder's a bad idea. I mean, in a open sense to full, like everyone has a right to do it. I would say that there's governments who've maybe tested the idea of murder.
Oh, yeah.
And there's
absolutely.
individuals who test those rights.
I was
But
gonna go-
generally speaking, there's truths within even these 10 Commandments, the law that God creates, that seem to be accepted regardless of any sort of culture differences.
Ben, what you're getting to is kind of where I was heading in the next point, okay? And here's the deal. People know there is a right and a wrong, even if they can't agree on what the right and wrong is. Even people who say what's right for you doesn't mean it has to be right for me are still going to get upset if you just take their wallet. There's something wrong about that, and they sense that.
There's some rights and wrongs we all agree on, and it has nothing to do with our commitment to God individually.
Well, why is it that we have this notion that there are some things? I can tell you, we have a little play farm, which means we're not real farmers, but we've got a few animals so I can watch them. I have a chicken, okay, that's crippled up. It was crippled up when I bought it. I just didn't notice it well enough. I had some roosters, and the roosters made the crippled chicken their target. And so every chance they could to brutalize it, they would. And so the little helpless chicken, hen, would simply find a little hole in the hen house and try to squirrel its whole body into that hole and just stay hidden all day long. It wouldn't go out. When the other chickens were getting their scratch of their feed, it would only try to venture out when everything else was ignoring it in some fashion, because they were basically picking the snot out of the thing. Would have killed it. Okay. Got rid of the roosters, and now the chicken is out with the other hens acting like it's somewhat normal, and it's not. But in any case,
Okay.
the roosters were not doing anything wrong. They were acting like roosters. But it bothered me. Why? They're animals. Survival of the fittest. When you have cows coming to eat, the big guys always push the little guys aside until they're done. If they go down for water, they don't wait for the ladies first. Biggest guy, the strongest guy goes first. Someone dies, they look at it and then step over it and just go. Okay? Why is it that we have this sense that there is a right and wrong? We didn't get it from nature.
That's true. I was just thinking that you see both sides of that occasionally, where people will imbue animals with our morality.
Yes.
Anthropomorphizing, that's called.
Oh, it's a hilarious. It's like these people who are going to rescue some poor sea creature, and then they set it back loose in the sea, and a shark comes up and eats it, and
Or them.
or them. But you're right. We do anthropomorphize. We do try to put human qualities into these animals, but actually they're acting just by nature.
Well, they don't have a moral code. They have what their genes tell them about.
A cat plays with a mouse before it eats it, but it keeps it alive for a while just to play with it, right?
Yeah.
I don't like cats. Nevertheless, it is not immoral because it isn't moral. But something about humans, there's something in us where I think there is a sense of right and wrong that is hardwired by God. C.S. Lewis calls it one of the clues to the meaning of the universe. This whole sense that there is some kind of a moral code. We agree there has to be a right and a wrong. What we don't agree on is the details. Okay?
And the devil's in the details.
The devil's in the details. But you see, we have this sense of morality. We have a sense there is a right and a wrong. Everybody believes there's a sense of a right and wrong, which is why they'll say it's still right and wrong for me. Right? They have this sense. But a whole lot of confusion as to the clarity. What's right? What's wrong? Where does it come from? And what I have the ability to do is something that I used to think was wrong. If I want to do it badly enough, I'll justify it.
Yeah, if it's profitable or pleasurable enough, all of a sudden it's the best for me.
I can come up with a reason why it's okay for me. If I feel an urge deeply enough, then I can justify my urge in some fashion. We call it rationalization, justification, all of those kind of things we're experts at.
Oh, we're amazing.
But the whole thing is, it's still playing with this internal sense there's got to be a right and a wrong. So I've got to convince myself, I've got to build myself a case that the thing that I used to think is wrong is now okay. I can't just do it because I had this sense that there was a wrong. And so I have to develop some kind of a justification for it. And I'm good at it. If I want to do something badly enough, I'll come up with a reason it's okay for me. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, it makes complete sense.
Yes.
Okay. So where does the clarity come from? Well, who gets to decide what's right and wrong? We have some options, right? One option is the one that you mentioned in the book of Judges, Ben. Just live by your own code. I'll do what's right for me and stay away from what's wrong for me. You do what's right for you and stay away from what's wrong for you. The problem is the end result of that is always anarchy.
Well, it's beautiful if I can do it without having any impact on anyone else around me.
Exactly.
But we don't live in isolation. And so anyone who's married can look at that and say that's not going to work, right? Because there's no sense in which there's freedom for each of us to do what's right and to just ignore whatever's wrong to us. That doesn't fit real well in the concept of a marriage. And again, this for me goes back to when we're talking about sin, we're not talking about the breaking of rules. We're talking about the breaking of relationships. When we're talking about doing what's right and wrong, this isn't even about trying to meet a code according to what God says. This is about how do we live in a world where right and wrong exists. How do we interact with the culture and the people around us?
Yeah, if you think of it on a community terms, it changes the whole equation, doesn't it? And you have to. And so one thing is just do what's right for you. And a lot of people are articulating that today, right? It cannot work, literally cannot work, and have a civilized relationship between people.
No.
Okay? Another way that it comes is majority rule. We'll vote on what's right.
That's assuming the majority is going to be right.
That's assuming that the majority is good.
It doesn't matter. The majority says it, so it's right.
That makes it right.
The majority does it, so it's good.
And the problem is, we've got have you ever known a majority of people to be wrong? There was a time when the majority of people wouldn't have had any issues with slavery, at least in some parts of the world. Does that mean that slavery was perfectly moral during that time?
It became immoral once their feelings changed.
Right.
Now, people don't want to go with that one. You can see the issues. Okay? We can vote on whether abortion is moral or not. And if as long as most people think it's moral, then go for it. It doesn't make it immoral as long as most people think it's okay. You can see the issues. Okay? If most people are ruthless and bloodthirsty, then go ahead and brutalize the person who misbehaved. How big is the majority? Is that the majority of the people in the world? The majority in a community? Are the rules in one community going to be different from the rules in another community? When you come to a nation like the U.S., do we have one set of rules for the blue states, another set of rules for the red states? I mean, you can see the issues. Okay? Majority rules. Which majority?
Oh, and we see this play out in politics because we care deeply about who holds the majority in the Senate or the House, who's in the White House, because we think somehow we can legislate morality.
Our morality.
And both sides are doing it. Everyone's trying to legislate what they believe to be the moral thing, as if somehow having that majority within that specific room is going to give them the authority to call something right or wrong.
Which means when one group is in power, there's one set of morality. And when another group is in power, there's another set of rules. The rules change. So there isn't a moral system. It's just basically majority rule. And then, of course, this next one is very related to it. It's just the rule of the powerful. I think I have a slide for all this stuff. Oops. I am way behind. I'm sorry. How about just the strongest? Whoever has the most power makes the rules for everybody else around him, which you're going to find in a lot. That's a tyrannical system, right?
And I think there's going to be some privilege that we're experiencing here in this conversation is by being in the United States. There's some privileges to the freedoms that we have as a nation that have allowed some of these conversations to take place. But if we were doing this in a different culture, I think this would be the one that would resonate with people more strongly. If we were elsewhere in different, I would say most other places in the world, this is what their culture looks like. It's not about who the majority likes, and it's not about what's right to me or wrong to you, but it's just whoever's in charge.
Whoever's in charge.
Whoever's the strongest.
And which is probably the kind of system that the Israelites came out of in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Pharaoh simply made the rules. And when the Pharaoh makes the rules, here's one of the interesting things about it, is that most of the time people with power, when they make rules, they're not always under the rules that they make. They just make the rules for other people.
Mm-hmm.
There can be a different set of rules for those in power than for those who are powerless.
And those rules can change.
And that's exactly right. As soon as either the person changes their mind or someone else usurps power.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rules change. But one of the big things about this, and I tried pointing this out Sunday, is that when there is a person like this establishing power, then you can get different classes of people being treated differently. I will treat my friends, my peers, one way, and I will treat those under me a different way. And what's to say that's wrong?
Your moral code, if you have one.
Well, if there's no moral code, that stands above, what difference does it make if I treat the people who are my color differently than the people who are not my color?
Or any other arbitrary.
Or any other arbitrary. People with my belief system, if I treat them differently than people not with my belief systems. People of my socioeconomic strata are differently than those who are not of my socioeconomic strata. Mm-hmm. The whole thing is that one of the things that we're going to find is that the law that God gave them was not only going to create the ability of civilized behavior as they do life with Him and with each other, but it was the great leveler. Because it didn't matter whether you were a king or a slave, you were subject to the same God who gave the law. There was not one set of laws for different levels of people. It was the great leveler. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now that's what's going to happen, because that's the other option. The idea is that what's right for me is a majority rule? Is that the strongest rule? What God does is says, well, I planted that moral system in you, and now let me tell you how it's supposed to fire. Okay? Let me give you some clarity. You will have no other gods but me. You will make no idols. Okay? You will set aside a Sabbath day. You will honor my name. You will honor your parents. You will not steal. You'll not murder. You'll not lie. You'll not commit adultery. You'll not covet. And God says, those are my rules. Okay? And these are not something that they voted on. It's not something where as a group they put together a committee and came together with the best rules that I thought were going to operate their community civilly. This is God saying, you're mine. Mm-hmm. These are how you play together. These are how you play with me. Okay? And it's an entirely different way of looking at it, I think. What do you guys think?
As I look through all these different options, I'm thinking through how this isn't... I mean, each of us has our own political ideas, right? And so it would be very easy for us to turn this into us trying to twist this to what we think ought to be happening politically.
Right.
And then what laws and moralities should be established.
I'm talking about the Old Testament.
But yeah, what I love about this is that these are all real things that exist in other parts of the world. We have examples of every single one of these, of what majority rule looks like, what powerful rule looks like. One of the things I was thinking was the fragility of some Middle Eastern countries in their rule. I think back even to like Afghanistan, and maybe even to some extent like Czechoslovakia now, right? The different countries that are in a fragile place, and you see a people that are persecuted or who are worked against by those who are in power, who specifically target them, try to remove them. You have examples in places like Rwanda with genocides. You have all these different examples of what this looks like when someone's in power. And what's fascinating to me in those moments is that sometimes what will happen is those people will fight up against that tyranny, right? Or you'll see other nations come in and support them to push back that tyranny and then try to stabilize. I think we've seen this in America in our own politics, where we've stepped in and we've tried to help other nations to stabilize them. And then when we withdraw, the people that were being hurt and persecuted are now suddenly the ones in power, and they do the exact same thing to the people who are hurting them before.
Yeah.
Because there's just that use of the power in that position, right? And It comes back to my appreciation of our country and the belief that there is the fact that we didn't try to go to what we want it to be. We didn't necessarily try to build a country that would be different than England that we came out of. We weren't trying to compete with them or take it out on them. What we really wanted was just try to create a more perfect union, a better idea of government. And I know it's debatable, but I believe that they started with God's law.
I think a lot of that goes back to the scarcity principle, which is if you have a pie, for instance, and you slice it up in pieces, if you take a piece of the pie, then that's a piece I'm not going to get. And that ignores the fact I can make another pie. So you have this scarcity. I'm going to fight for all that's there because I want as much as I can get, and that means taking it from you, as opposed to figuring out how to generate whatever it is I want. And I think you see the United States having generated our own wealth and everything and shared it.
Yes, and try to elevate that of others, which is I think more moral than just trying to make my own. By the way, when it comes to pie, make your own. You don't need to share mine.
I think I will.
That's fine.
That's
What pie are you making?
cherry, always
Cherry's
cherry.
your pie?
Yes.
I would rather have cherry than apple. I think you're an apple guy, aren't you?
I love pie.
Yeah.
There we go.
Cherry
So you're not
pie
being
is
picky.
good. Apple pie is good. Pecan
Rhubarb.
pie is good.
Rhubarb, not so much.
Chocolate. I agree with you on rhubarb. I have eaten it, and I could if I were really, 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 really hungry.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I was attacked by rhubarb as a young child, and it scarred me.
There's one other piece to this thing. This is a place where I didn't go at all on Sunday morning. Some of these things I just kind of brushed alongside on Sunday in my sermon. But another piece, when you start looking at the law, is there is a recognition by God that his people are going to fail in following this law. I'm going to give it to them. I'm going to show them right and wrong. Okay? I'm going to give them a set of standards to live by that'll help them relate to me and relate to each other. I know they're going to mess up. You know why? Because we mess up. We all sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our heart is deceitful and desperately wicked, like Jeremiah the prophet said. And so we're going to mess up, okay? So God made provision for the mess-ups in the law itself. That was grace. God could have given the rules, and every time you break the rule, I got you. But God put into the law a way to take care of those infractions, to get back right with each other and to get back right with God. He built grace into the law. Because getting back right with God, a sacrifice, is just symbolic. It's a way to picture and access the forgiveness of God in the middle of your failures. So the whole sacrificial system, which plays a big part of the Old Testament prior to Jesus, because Jesus came to be the one sacrifice and the rest of it wasn't necessary any longer. But the whole sacrificial system is an expression of grace. It's a means to find forgiveness and reconciliation, which is what grace was all about. A means to find forgiveness and reconciliation, right?
You know, people could argue, someone could argue that going back a few minutes in our discussion, that God himself is a bully because he's the one making all the rules. But he coats everything, saturates everything with grace and benevolence, and that makes him God and not a bully.
It's interesting to me that we look at the law as being almost this setup against us. Like God's going to give us rules so that he can catch us, as if that's what he wants to do. And as we're having this discussion, for me, it just seems like the law exists not to try to catch us, but to really just help us. It's like I sit down with married couples, or couples before they get married, and we do counseling things. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is expectations. And what I found is they don't they don't have to always choose the same moral thing, but if they have the same expectations, they'll at least not get caught off guard by that, right? Right? There's lots of people who've had good, successful marriages without having to be Jesus followers because they do have the same expectations, right? I think that's such a huge part of this. Sometimes we think that God's giving us this law as if he's just setting us up to fail, and I don't think that's what it is. I think he's just clearly communicating to us what's best for us. The same you would if you were communicating to your spouse what it is that you're expecting from them in a relationship, so that they know what the targets are to be able to have a good, healthy relationship.
See, most of these laws are not just arbitrary. This is what you're getting at, okay? You can find some, because he not only gives them religious laws, but he also gives them a lot of civil laws. He's trying to set up where you can do life together. And so there's a whole lot of reasons for a lot of the different laws in there. But the whole idea is that it's not just a matter where God says, well, I think I'll make this wrong and I think I'll make this right arbitrarily. Okay? What he's saying is that this is going to break relationship. So it's bad. So it's wrong. And so he identifies the wrong, attaches a punishment. Okay, because if you walk down this path, you're going to hurt each other. You're going to hurt your relationship with God. You're going to hurt each other. You know, it's going to be deleterious in the end. All right. But he not only does that, but knowing that it's going to break relationship, how do I bring you back together? How do I bring you back to me? And so
that's fascinating. I just had this thought. I'm sorry. So I got a Andy Stanley book recently that he and his wife wrote together about parenting, and they talk about parenting their young kids. And they talked about what discipline looks like and what they would discipline for. And he defined sin in a very similar way that you just said it, of whenever sin happens or whenever a rule is broken within our home, it's not so much that a rule's broken and we're upset because we have to protect the rule. The problem is that there's someone behind that rule. There's someone who loses. There's someone who's hurt because of that rule. So then in discipline, and the discipline of their children, what they did was they disciplined in a way that would restore relationship. The discipline always somehow was an act towards building the relationship back up. That's fascinating to me as we're having this conversation and you begin thinking about God and his work with the Old Testament laws, and specifically what an incredible grace it is that he gives us the sacrificial system.
yes,
It's a specific way. It's not so much that, hey, don't do these things or else. It's, hey, this is the best way to live. When you get it wrong, the discipline is going to be the steps you take to rebuild a relationship.
Yes.
The ways that you work to fix or to resolve with the person who loses because of your sin.
including God. But
Sometimes it's God.
Yeah.
Most times it's the people around us.
But you see that one of the things that you touched on, which is fascinating, is that in the Bible, every sin against you is also a sin against God. Why? Because you're God's kid. Okay? And this whole idea, yes, there's going to be, part of the sacrificial system is how to get right with each other. But part of the sacrificial system is as a result of your sin, you not only offend your neighbor, but you also offend your God, whose child it is that you just wounded. Right? You hurt my kid. You went after my wife. And there's a sense in which the whole sacrificial system is based on this idea that, yes, we sin against each other, but a sin against each other is also a sin against our God. We not only violate his will, we are putting a wall.
That's connecting us back to the idea that all of this is from his character. In fact, his law is a way of him revealing who he is.
Yes.
And it's also connecting to this idea that we've talked about, that we're made in his image. So then we bear some of that same expectation of character.
There seems to be a principle that you can see in the things that God does and creates, is that they are cohesive. They fit together.
Yeah.
You don't have to polish off edges to make them work. He's got the end in mind, so all these things have been arranged so that they fit together and are profitable for us.
So let's look at the sacrificial system for a little bit. There are 5 basic types of offerings, sacrifices in the sacrificial system. And you can read about this if you want, about the first 5, 6, 7 chapters of Leviticus, where it kind of lays these out. And then later on in Leviticus, it kind of unpacks some more details on each one of these things. But it starts out with a burnt offering, okay, which is offered in the tabernacle or later in the temple twice a day for all of Israel, plus an individual could do that himself. But basically, I have sinned, or Israel has sinned, and we make atonement for the sins of the people. Okay? Some animal is sacrificed. Ordinarily, you'd lay your hand on top of the head of that animal. They would kill it. That represents that animal is dying for you, for what you have done. Okay? And it's a way to continue to do life with God despite your sin. It's a way of reconciling, getting back with God by recognizing that something deserved to die because of the sin that you committed.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's not just the brutality of the thing, and back then it was a very brutal world. Okay, it's this whole idea is you're going to mess up. I know you're going to mess up, so I'm building in place a way for this the burnt offering to be offered on a regular basis, both by the priests for you and by you.
Mm-hmm. And that foreshadowed Jesus.
You think?
Who is the sacrifice who actually shed blood on our behalf, and so we don't have to. And isn't it death is the penalty of sin?
Well, that's one of the things that you're going to see through this. It's starting to point that direction. But they would kill a sheep, a goat, a bull, a dove, or a pigeon, which didn't need to happen after God let his own son die, which is kind of bigger than a bull or goat or a pigeon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And took care of it. Then there was what's called the grain offering. And the grain offering was a little different because basically it was just a way to love on God. Okay, it's an expression of devotion to God. It's your recognition that God is good and that he's provided for you. And so you would offer some kind of a grain, okay, to him. And that's just simply a way to honor your relationship with God.
That's what the priests would eat, correct?
Yes, that provided food for the priests. Then you have the peace offering, which is basically a festive meal. You're just sharing a meal together, which is celebrating your peace with God, celebrating your peace with each other, and celebrating your peace with God, which is interesting, building that into the thing. You know, we are doing life with God. We're going to celebrate this peace. It's a Thanksgiving meal almost. Only instead of just Thanksgiving, thankful for the big fat turkey and gravy, you're actually thanking God for the peace you have with him and for his provisions for you. It's a Thanksgiving meal.
An offering to God even whenever you aren't in a bad relationship.
You got it.
Like even when you haven't hurt the relationship.
Yeah. Then you've got the sin offering. Okay? And this sin offering was a little bit different because essentially it is specifically targeted at what are called unwitting sins or unintentional sins. There are a lot of times, most of the sins I have committed have been committed in ignorance. They've not been a willful act of rebellion, although I've got a boatload of those.
Yeah, I'm not short in either category.
I'm not short at all. Okay?
Most of mine
But
were
how many
committed-
times do you discover later, I shouldn't have done that?
Yeah.
Maybe you didn't know the rules well. You know, people become a Christian. They don't know what the standards are yet. They're just learning. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the things they do, it may take a while before they clean up their mouth and clean up their minds and these kind of things. And then they begin to realize, goodness gracious, I've been doing this for a long time, and it's not the way God wants me to live.
Mm-hmm. Well, by a contrast, we work from the perspective that ignorance of the law is no excuse.
Oh, that's true. That's true. And here's a way of getting right.
Mm-hmm.
Or this one, sometimes they're just ceremonial sins, ceremonial
Yes.
uncleanness. For example, back then, you're not supposed to touch a dead body. But if your wife dies, you're probably going to bury her. But you'd be unclean for a time. Okay? And so this is a way of getting cleansed after the uncleanness. So you've got these sin offerings. Then you've got this guilt offering, or some people call it a reparation offering, which is interesting in light of the modern discussions of reparations. But basically, it's an expression that you're not receiving just forgiveness from God, but you try to make it right with the person that you hurt. And so if you cost them $100, you'd give them $120 back as part of that offering. You'd give them what you took plus your penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so it's a way of restoring relationships with people that you have hurt and wounded. Interesting, huh?
Really.
Restoring a relationship with God, restoring a relationship with each other. And all of these things are a way to live in grace. Even though it's built into a system of laws, which we see as almost the antithesis of grace, all of these are ways to keep enjoying the grace of God despite your sin, despite recognizing it as sin. Okay?
Similar to, this is cheapening it a bunch, but similar to like apologizing within the context of my home. When I do something that offends or hurts or upsets my wife, I have to make it right in some way. And it's nice that apologies exist.
And sometimes based on your apology, she says, okay, and lets it go.
That's been known to happen.
And
and sometimes
I'm trying to
sometimes
think.
dinner's involved, and sometimes jewelry's involved. Sometimes flowers are involved, right? Like it depends on we see the different kinds of offerings to God. There's different kinds of offerings to the wife to make her happy.
Whether a bull to sheep or a pigeon. I'm a bull, a sheep, or a pigeon, right?
Yeah. I've never had to buy her one of those. She was talking the other day about getting another dog. I don't think I've done anything bad enough that I would need to do that.
Now, the only other thing that I was going to dig into in light of this, the law and grace, is this idea of witting versus unwitting sins. Okay? Now, understand, is it a sin if it's not an act of rebellion? Sometimes you do something wrong, not because you're trying to diss God, okay? But you just blew it. This was not, I know it's wrong, and I'm going to do it anyway, which is what a lot of our sins are. That's what Apostle Paul talks about in Romans 7. Sometimes we do things that we learn are wrong. Learn we're wrong. Something we shouldn't have said, something we shouldn't have done. It's not exactly rebellion. For example, I'll give an example out of Acts. You killed the author of life. You guys crucified the guy, your creator. You guys killed the one who breathed life into you. 2 verses later, but I know that you acted in ignorance. You really didn't know who he was. You didn't act what you were doing. You committed the most heinous of sins, and you thought you were doing it for God. You thought you were being God-honoring when you killed Jesus. You thought he deserved it. And when he rose from the dead, you know what? You killed him, God raised him. Guess what that makes you, dude?
So sin requires intentionality.
No, a witting sin requires intentionality. Okay?
Yeah.
A witting sin.
And that's the story of Paul, who was murdering Christians, not just Jesus himself, but his followers and the persecution of them. And when he comes to faith in Jesus, it's not like he doesn't look back at that time in his life and think that, it wasn't a sin because I didn't know it was bad.
No, he came later to recognize. What I did, I was heinous, and I thought I was being godly.
Isn't that the definition of repentance?
That is, Ben, when you start talking about a change of mind, so you're beginning to see it through God's eyes rather than your own or people's eyes. That's part of it. And so that's just, I wanted to just spend just a moment unpacking that one a little bit, because that one's kind of confusing. Sometimes there are unwitting sins. Now, personally, and this is something I don't have a verse for. I mean, there's some verses that I think I can get close to it. There's a concept called culpability. Culpability means, am I going to be held responsible by God for an unwitting sin? I think God tends to be more gracious with ignorance than he does with rebelliousness. Okay? And I think you can find that principle in the scriptures, that he tends to be more gracious with ignorance, just like that Acts 3. Okay? Still did wrong. But I am more concerned in my conscious repentance to take care of the ones where I discover that I have rebelled against God and ask forgiveness for them. What these sacrifices for unwitting sins did, which is pretty cool, is that they recognized they committed them. didn't always know about it, so they offered sacrifices for those sins that they may not even known they had committed. And they still recognize it's against God. I think it's kind of a cool idea.
Mm-hmm.
Like the husband who apologizes even when he doesn't know if he's done anything wrong.
Oh, that's smart. I'm sorry. For what? I don't know. I'm sure I did something. You'll let me know later what it was.
Yeah. I got a question for you. One of the things I think about in terms of specifically grace of God and the commandments or law that God gives in the Old Testament, one of the things I think about, and then connecting in the idea of the sacrifices, is the scapegoat that God uses. Help me out. Is that part of the burnt offering, or is that a different offering that we're talking about? That's not one of the basic kinds.
That would have been on the Day of Atonement. That would have been just one time a year. And they would have had that kind of a scapegoat. And so it would be related to the burnt offering. It's going to be similar to that. But trust me, I'm not good at the Old Testament law.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I love about it, and it's been a while since I've done study on it, so that's why I'm a little bit vague on it. But I remember years ago doing a sermon on it, and in my study, I was just blown away by the behavior of the people, like the process of what happened when they had this scapegoat. Okay, so like you have this goat that would be brought out, and Aaron would put his hands on it, whatever else. He'd confess the sins of the people, but this goat would be like led off and out of the community, right? Like it would be just left into the wilderness. Okay, and the people would curse at it. They would throw things at it. They would, they were appalled by this goat, and I was so like, I find it humorous. The goat's just a goat. It's just your standard goat. The only reason it's appalling is because of you. Like, it was their sin that made this animal so offensive. And then they would act the way they did. But what a beautiful picture of grace that God's doing, that he creates this whole system, and how the people would behave, I think, is, again, kind of humorous. But the idea that they were free from the guilt of who they were and what they had done, and that God would create this way in which it could be cast onto a goat, and we wouldn't have to be held responsible for it. I think it's just a beautiful,
which is another image of Jesus too.
Yeah. It's all prelude to Jesus.
And I have heard that you're planning some similar ceremony when you finally kick me out of my office.
There will be some goat sacrifice.
There's going to be casting the sins of the church on me and throwing me out.
No,
as the people mutter their curses.
No. We'll do all that stuff. It'll just be put on a goat instead of on and we'll pretend like it's not you. It's the goat.
All right. That's all I have, guys. Okay. So what's coming up?
Couple things. We do not have. We're not going to do this video next Wednesday night. We'll be taking a week off because we're actually going to be doing our training for volunteers and different people, next level training that we're doing next week. And so that's next Thursday, 5:30. We'll start our training stuff at 6:25 upstairs in the worship center with everybody together. If you are on any sort of volunteer team, if you're a part of any ministry team, service team that we have, like on Sunday mornings or during the week, we would love for you to be a part of that.
Or if you're interested.
More important, really, actually, we would be more excited if you aren't involved in any of those things, but you would like to be. If you would come, we would love to plug you in, get you connected with any of those kinds of teams, opportunities to serve within the church. And then 2 weeks from tonight will be our first Wednesday nights here at the church, where we start up our normal growth groups and programming. We'll have our meals at 5:30 like we do. We have our programming for kids and students to be a part of. And then we will have a class like this. It'll just be in person. We're done with doing this online.
Yep. Anything else?
No, that's it.
No, you're good? That's all?
Okay. Sunday, we're going to continue this series, and we're going to be talking about the grace in the story of King David, which is a remarkable grace story. Yeah. And so that's where we're going to go. And that's, again, an Old Testament grace story, and it just drips with grace. And so we'll be continuing. That'll be Sermon 7 in this 10-week series. We've got 3 more after that, so we'll be wrapping this one up. I think that's all I've got, guys. You got anything else?
Nope, that's good. Thanks for joining us, guys. There were no questions or many comments tonight. We must have been on point so well that they didn't feel the need to correct us on anything.
Or they all went to sleep.
Yeah, that's very possible. So thanks again for joining us, guys. We're glad that you participate in us or in this with us, and we will see you in person which again, we'll also be offering it online. It'll be streamed as we have done in the past. But we'll see you in 2 weeks in person.
Okay,
Thanks, guys.
see you guys.
Good night.